I had just learned how to sit still again. Paris will do that to you if you let it. It doesn't demand attention the way New York does, or glare at you like Los Angeles. It waits. It assumes you'll catch up. That morning, I let myself fall into its rhythm, which felt like a small rebellion after years of alarms, meeting blocks, and performance reviews disguised as alignment conversations. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. The cafe was narrow, all wood and glass, with tables so close together that you could hear strangers breathe. I chose it for that reason, no privacy, no room for theatrics, just coffee, sunlight, and the low murmur of other lives unfolding at arm's length. I was on approved leave, signed off, documented, cleared 3 layers up. I had the email saved, starred, and printed in my bag like a passport. Senior operations strategists don't take spontaneous vacations. We take planned decompression windows, which is corporate language for permission to remember you're human. I stirred my coffee and watched the foam collapse in slow circles. Across the street, a delivery truck tried and failed to wedge itself into a space clearly designed for bicycles and optimism. The driver shrugged, lit a cigarette, and leaned against the door as if time itself could be negotiated. That's when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it buzz once more than necessary. Old habit. Control the pace. When I answered, I didn't say my name. "Evan," Harold Pierce said, as if he were correcting me for being late. His voice was exactly the same as it had been the first time I met him, 12 years earlier, when he shook my hand and assessed my worth in the time it takes to blink. Calm, flat, certain that the world functioned best when he told it how. "You're done," he continued. "We don't pay people who rest." I smiled. It surprised me, that smile. It rose on its own, uninvited, like a reflex I didn't know I had. A waiter passed with a tray of croissants, and for a moment I wondered if this was how people learned they were free. "I'm on approved leave," I said. My voice sounded rested. That felt new. "You're on borrowed time," Harold replied. "Your role requires presence, commitment, loyalty." I pictured his office back home, the windows that didn't open, the chair that faced the door so visitors always felt smaller than they intended, the framed values statement with words like endurance and obedience printed in tasteful gray. "I'll see you when I'm back," I said. "You won't," he said. "Send your access badge to security. HR will formalize this." The line went quiet, but I didn't rush to fill it. I looked at my reflection in the cafe window instead. 38, no visible cracks. A man who had done exactly what he was told for long enough that people forgot he had options. I ended the call. Across from me, the man who had been pretending not to listen raised his glass. "Bold move," he said, in English touched with something that sounded like the Midwest. "Hanging up on Harold Pierce." I turned. He was older, early 50s maybe, with the posture of someone who spent less time proving himself these days. No tie, crisp jacket, the kind of calm that comes from knowing how things tend to end. "You know him?" I asked. "I know his reputation," the man said, "and his habits." He held out his hand. "Victor Nolan." I took it. His grip was firm without making a point of it. "Evan Cooper," I said. "I know." Of course he did. Victor gestured to the empty chair at his table, though my cup was already half finished. "Sit. You look like a man who just lost a job and gained an afternoon." "I didn't lose anything," I said, and realized I believed it. We ordered more coffee. The waiter nodded as if refills were a civic duty. Outside, the delivery truck finally moved, scraping the curb in a way that made the driver wince. Victor watched me over the rim of his cup. "You're calmer than most people in your position." "I'm tired," I said. "It's different." He laughed softly. "Yes, it is." I didn't ask why he was there. Men like Victor Nolan don't explain themselves until they've decided it's useful. Instead, I asked the question that mattered. "Why did you say bold move?" "Because Harold doesn't fire people on vacation unless he thinks they're already gone," Victor said, "or unless he's trying to send a message." "To who?" I asked. Victor reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a thin folder. He didn't slide it across the table yet. He let it sit between us like a shared secret. "To you," he said, "and to anyone watching." I felt a familiar tightening in my chest then. Not panic, not fear, but the recognition of a system misbehaving. I'd spent my career noticing that feeling and tracing it back to its source. It was the reason Harold had hired me in the first place. "My leave was approved," I said, more to myself than to Victor. "By people who report to him, Victor replied. Approval isn't the same as permission. I thought of Laura, my wife. Corporate communications, which meant she translated power into language that sounded reasonable. Lately, that language had followed her home. Replaceable, adaptable, long-term fit. She said those words at dinner as if they were observations, not warnings. She said he was under pressure, I said. That the board was restless. Victor nodded. They are. That happens when your competitor starts anticipating your moves. I looked at the folder again. I don't share proprietary information. Victor smiled, and it wasn't unkind. No, he said. You write it. I sat back. The chair creaked. The cafe noise swelled and receded like a tide. Somewhere a phone rang, and no one rushed to answer it. Your operational forecasts, Victor continued. Your contingency frameworks. They've been circulating. That's not possible, I said. It is, he said, because they didn't come from you. I laughed then, a short sound that drew a glance from the next table. You're saying someone copied my work? I'm saying someone curated it, Victor replied. Selected pieces, removed context, sold it as insight. The tightening in my chest eased, replaced by clarity. That, too, felt familiar. Laura has access, I said. Victor didn't react. He didn't need to. She stopped forwarding certain threads, I went on. Said they weren't relevant. She started quoting her father more, correcting my phrasing. You noticed, Victor said. Of course I did. He finally pushed the folder toward me. Inside were charts I recognized as easily as my own handwriting. Scenario trees I had built at 2 a.m, coffee cooling beside my keyboard, assumptions annotated in my shorthand. What do you want? I asked. Victor leaned back. What do you want? I considered the question. The cafe had filled. The sun had shifted, catching dust in the air and turning it into something almost decorative. I thought of the email approving my leave, the way Laura had kissed my cheek that morning and said, Try not to think about work. I want my work to be mine, I said. Victor nodded. Then we can talk. We talked for an hour. Not about revenge, not about exposure, about boundaries, authorship, what belonged to contracts and what belonged to people. He explained in careful terms what he could and couldn't accept. No restricted materials, no confidential streams, only strategies I could prove were authored independently. I keep records, I said. I assumed you did. By the time we stood to leave, the afternoon had softened into something like evening. Victor shook my hand again. You'll hear from Harold, he said. He doesn't like silence. I do, I replied. Outside, Paris moved around me as if nothing had changed. I walked without checking my phone. That felt like a small victory. I crossed the river, watched the water carry reflections downstream without asking permission. That night, in the hotel room, I finally looked at my messages. 12 missed calls. Laura's name lit the screen again and again. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up my archives. Every version, every timestamp, the story of my work told in metadata and margins. I wasn't angry, not yet, but I was awake. The flight home felt shorter than it should have. Not because time moved faster, but because my attention was elsewhere, folded inward, replaying small moments I had ignored when they were harmless and now refused to stay quiet. Laura met me at the airport with a smile that arrived a half-second late. It was the kind of delay you only notice when you're already listening for it. She hugged me with both arms, efficient, practiced, like a demonstration rather than a reflex. How was Paris? She asked. Quiet, I said. She nodded, relieved. Good. You needed that. Her phone buzzed before we reached the car. She glanced at the screen, thumb hovering, then slipped it back into her bag untouched. Another half-second, another note filed. At home, everything looked the same. The framed photos, the carefully neutral furniture, the kitchen island where conversations had been slowly rewritten over the past year. I watched Laura move through the space, setting down her bag, aligning the mail without reading it, turning on the kettle she didn't use. You should check your email, she said lightly. HR will probably want to follow up. I will, I replied. I didn't move. She hesitated, then sat across from me at the island. Dad's under a lot of pressure right now. There it was. The word dad, used as justification rather than relationship. I'm aware, I said. He didn't mean it personally. I'm sure, I said, and meant nothing by it. That night, I slept lightly. Not poorly, lightly, as if my mind had decided rest was optional now that vigilance was back on the table. At 3 a.m, I got up and walked the house, listening to its familiar sounds, the refrigerator's low hum, The distant traffic, Laura's breathing, steady and untroubled. In the morning, I logged into my work email from the study. My access was still active. That told me more than any termination notice could have. Harold liked control too much to cut ties cleanly. He wanted options. The inbox was thinner than it should have been. Threads I knew were in motion simply weren't there. Not deleted, never delivered. I searched by project code. Nothing. I searched by sender. Gaps. I leaned back and let the chair roll until it touched the wall. I stared at the ceiling and thought about Victor's folder. About curation. Laura knocked softly and stepped in without waiting. "Coffee?" "Please," I said. She set the mug down beside my keyboard, glanced at the screen, and looked away just as quickly. "Any updates?" "Not yet," I said. She smiled, relieved again. "It'll work out." I watched her leave. The door clicked shut with a sound I'd never noticed before. Over the next few days, I said very little. I let Laura fill the space with explanations she hadn't been asked to give. She talked about alignment, about messaging, about how some information was better filtered so people didn't overreact. "Filtered by who?" I asked once. She paused. "By the people responsible." "For what?" "For outcomes." I nodded, as if that settled it. At work, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. In meetings, my name was mentioned less. When it was, it came with qualifiers. Former, previous iteration, legacy approach. People spoke around me as if I were already a footnote. I started keeping my own notes again, not on the company system. In a plain document, time-stamped, backed up twice. I tracked what I was invited to and what I wasn't. Who spoke after I did. Who avoided eye contact. One evening, a calendar notification appeared and disappeared within seconds. I caught it out of the corner of my eye. A meeting I had designed, scheduled without me. I waited until after hours. The building emptied slowly, the way it always did, with people pretending not to rush. I stayed at my desk until the lights dimmed to their evening setting, then walked the corridors that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old coffee. The conference room was still warm, chairs slightly out of alignment, a whiteboard wiped too clean. I stood outside the door and listened, not for voices, for the absence of them. In the trash, I found a printed agenda. My agenda. Edited, sections removed, language softened, risk reduced to opportunity. Footsteps echoed down the hall. I stepped back, heart steady, and watched two colleagues pass, heads bent together. They didn't see me, or pretended not to. "Did she send it?" one asked. "She said she would," the other replied. "She always does." I didn't follow them. I didn't need to. At home, Laura was on the phone when I arrived. She lowered her voice when she saw me, turned away, and ended the call quickly. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yes," she said, too fast. "Just work?" I nodded. "Of course." That night, I opened my laptop again and compared timestamps. Emails I'd sent that were forwarded hours later. Attachments renamed, comments stripped of attribution. The pattern was elegant, careful. Someone had been standing between me and the flow, deciding what version of me the company saw. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark. Laura slept beside me, her back turned, her phone face down on the nightstand. I thought of the café in Paris, of Victor's calm certainty, of the way Harold spoke about loyalty as if it were currency. In the morning, I dressed early and left without waking her. I went to the office and took the stairs instead of the elevator, counting floors, breathing evenly. In my inbox, a message waited from Harold's assistant. A request for a meeting, not a summons, a request. I didn't reply. Instead, I walked to the communications floor, Laura's territory. I stood outside the glass wall and watched her through it, headset on, gesturing lightly as she spoke, confident, in control. She looked up and saw me. Her smile faltered, then recovered. She ended the call and stepped out. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "Working," I said. Her eyes flicked to the hallway. "This isn't a good time." "When would be?" I asked. She sighed. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "For who?" "For everyone." I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "Have you been deciding which of my emails get sent?" Her face changed then. Not dramatically, just enough. "I was protecting you," she said. I nodded slowly. "From what?" "From yourself," she replied. "From pushing too hard. From becoming a problem." I stepped back. The glass wall reflected us. Two professionals framed by a company that suddenly felt very small. I walked away without another word. Back at my desk, I replied to Victor's last message with a single sentence. "I'm ready." As I shut down my computer, I understood something with complete clarity. Laura hadn't betrayed me in a moment. She had edited me over time, and she had been very good at it. I stopped waiting for permission the morning after I sent that message. Victor replied before sunrise with a time and an address. No greeting, no reassurance, just coordinates and the word tomorrow. I appreciated that. It told me he understood something fundamental. When momentum shows up, you don't ask it to sit down. At home, Laura moved around me like a professional courtesy. Polite, distant, she asked if I wanted eggs and didn't wait for the answer. We were two people sharing a space, careful not to disturb the arrangement. "I'm meeting someone today," I said, tying my shoes. She glanced up. "About work?" "About ownership," I replied. She frowned but didn't press. That told me more than any argument could have. Curiosity had limits now. So did loyalty. The address Victor sent led to a low-rise building near the river, all glass and discretion, the kind of place that didn't advertise what happened inside. The receptionist nodded when I gave my name and gestured me through without checking anything. Power recognized power, even when it pretended not to. Victor stood when I entered, jacket off, sleeves rolled, like he'd been waiting, but not impatiently. On the table between us were 2 folders and a tablet. "Sit," he said. I did. "We keep this simple," he continued. "You don't bring me anything that belongs to Harold's company. You don't violate your contract. You don't improvise." "I don't need to," I said. "I kept everything." He nodded. "Show me." I opened my own folder. Not paper, printouts of logs, version histories, comments with timestamps that matched my travel records, my calendar, my sleep patterns, the quiet proof of authorship that only someone obsessive enough to document their own thinking could produce. Victor scanned without interrupting. He asked questions that mattered. "When did you draft this? Who reviewed it? Where was it stored?" I answered without embellishment. "This stays clean," he said finally. "Consulting, limited scope, no exclusivity." "I don't want exclusivity," I said. "I want separation." He smiled then. "You're already ahead of most people." We signed, ink on paper. No ceremony. When I stood to leave, Victor stopped me. "One more thing," he said. "You should expect resistance, not from Harold, from the people who benefited from the arrangement." "I'm counting on it," I replied. Back at the office, I moved differently. Not faster, more precisely. I stopped volunteering explanations. I stopped softening language. When people asked what I was working on, I told them exactly what was public and nothing more. In the afternoon, my access flickered. Not off, restricted. Certain directories no longer opened. Certain tools prompted for permissions I'd never needed before. I smiled at the screen. After hours, I stayed again. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see what happened when the building forgot about me. The lights dimmed, the hum changed pitch. The elevators slowed. I logged into my personal archive and cross-referenced one last time. Everything I needed was there. I backed it up again, then shut the laptop and stood. That's when the security system chirped. A polite sound, neutral. The kind that suggested a reminder rather than a threat. I checked my phone. No alerts. I walked to the door. It didn't open. I stood there for a moment, considering possibilities. The building had protocols for after-hours access. I was still authorized. Technically. I walked to the nearest window. It didn't open either. "Of course," I said aloud, to no one. I could call security. Explain. Wait. But waiting had become a habit I was trying to break. Instead, I walked the floor. Counted doors. Noted which offices still had power. Which emergency lights were brighter than the rest. In a copy room, I found a manual override panel half hidden behind a cabinet. Someone hadn't bothered to finish installing it. I moved the cabinet an inch at a time, careful not to scrape the floor. I didn't rush. Rushing makes noise. When the panel was clear, I read the instructions twice. The alarm chirped again, still polite. I disengaged the lock and waited. Nothing dramatic happened. The door opened with the same soft click it always had. In the stairwell, my footsteps echoed. I smiled again, this time without humor. Someone had wanted to see if I'd panic. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner. I took a long breath and walked to my car, hands steady. At home, Laura was awake, sitting on the couch, phone in hand. "Security called," she said. "They said you triggered a protocol." "I resolved it," I replied. She looked at me for a long moment. "You don't have to do this." "Do what?" I asked. "Make things worse." I took off my jacket and set it down carefully. I'm not making anything. I'm observing. She shook her head. Dad thinks you're being difficult. I laughed quietly. He always did. She stood. He wants to talk. I know. And? And I'll decide when. That night I slept deeply. Not because things were settled, but because they weren't. There's a relief and clarity that rest responds to. The next day the auditors arrived. Not officially, not announced. They showed up as calendar blocks and quiet meetings. People closed doors, lowered voices, smiled too much. Laura didn't come home for lunch. When she did that evening, her composure was cracked just enough to show strain. They're asking questions, she said. They should, I replied. She paced. I told them I didn't do anything wrong. I'm sure you did, I said. She stopped. You think this is funny? No, I said. I think it's accurate. She stared at me, searching for something familiar. It wasn't there. I was trying to help, she said finally. I believe you, I replied. And I did. That was the problem. Later, alone in the study, I reviewed the consulting agreement again. Clean, limited, mine. I sent Victor a brief update. He responded with a single word. Good. The next morning, my calendar was empty. Completely. No meetings, no placeholders, nothing. I smiled at the blank screen. By noon, messages started coming in. Requests, clarifications, invitations to conversations that weren't meetings. I answered selectively. When Harold's name appeared, I didn't open it. Instead, I packed up my desk. Not everything, just what mattered. A notebook, a pen, a framed photo I hadn't noticed in months. As I left the building, someone called my name, a colleague, one of the quieter ones. Careful, he said softly. I am, I replied. In the car, I didn't turn on the radio. I drove in silence, thinking about systems, about how they resist change until they can't, about how pressure reveals structure. By the time I reached home, I understood something new. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. The building didn't change when the auditors arrived. That was the first thing I noticed. Same lobby, same security desk, same art that pretended to mean something. The difference was in how people moved through it, like the air pressure had shifted and only some of us could feel it. They didn't announce themselves. They never do. They showed up as extra chairs in conference rooms and unfamiliar names added to email threads that had previously been tidy. People started saying things like, just for completeness and out of an abundance of caution. Language thickened. Smiles became brittle. Laura stopped speaking in generalities. They're asking about document flow, she said that evening, standing in the kitchen without turning on the lights. About who had access to what. I poured a glass of water and leaned against the counter. That sounds reasonable. She exhaled sharply. You're enjoying this. I considered that. No, I said. I'm paying attention. She laughed once without humor. Dad thinks this is temporary. Of course he does, I replied. That's how power comforts itself. The next morning, Harold called. Not from his assistant's line, from his own phone. A small concession meant to feel generous. Evan, he said, warm now, let's reset. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make the warmth feel earned. Reset how? There's been a misunderstanding, he said. Emotions ran high. We can correct course. By restoring my role? I asked. By redefining it, he replied. Something more suitable. I smiled at the wall. I'm not looking for suitability. He paused. You've always been ambitious. I've always been precise, I said. He cleared his throat. Come in. Let's talk like adults. I am, I replied. That's why I'm not coming in. The call ended with politeness layered over frustration. I set the phone down and went for a walk. The neighborhood was quiet. The kind of quiet that made your footsteps sound louder than they should. I liked that. It reminded me that I occupied space. By midweek, the tension had pooled. People I'd worked with for years suddenly needed to check their calendars before speaking to me. Others avoided me entirely, as if proximity alone carried risk. One of them didn't. His name was Thomas Reed, mid-level operations manager. Careful, efficient. He'd been one of the first to benefit from my frameworks, presenting them with a confidence that suggested authorship. We'd never discussed it. Until now. He caught up to me in the parking structure late one evening, his footsteps quickening when he realized I wasn't stopping. Evan, he called. Wait. I did, beside my car. The concrete echoed, amplifying the distance between us. Look, he said, hands raised slightly. I don't want trouble. Neither do I replied. I want clarity. He swallowed. I didn't know it would go this far. Far from what? I asked. From optimization, he said weakly. I stepped closer, not invading his space, just narrowing it. Who told you it was acceptable to present my work as yours? He glanced toward the ramp, then back at me. Laura said it was fine, that it had been approved. I nodded. Approved by whom? Her father, he said. I leaned against my car and crossed my arms. Did you ever ask me? He shook his head. I assumed. That's where you went wrong, I said calmly. Assumptions are expensive. He looked genuinely afraid then, not of me, but of the consequences unfolding around him. I let that sit. You're going to tell the auditors exactly what happened, I continued. In your own words, no embellishment. And if I don't? He asked. I gestured to his car. Then you'll continue driving it, knowing every system you rely on is built by people you underestimated. That tends to keep people awake. He stared at me, searching for threat. Finding none. That was the point. I'll tell them, he said. I know, I replied. I got into my car and drove away, leaving him standing there with his reflection warped across polished metal. At home, Laura was waiting again. This time, she didn't bother with pretense. They're reviewing my access logs, she said. They asked why certain messages didn't reach you. I took off my jacket. What did you say? That I filtered noise, she replied. That I was helping. And did that help? I asked. She didn't answer. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. Not publicly, quietly. Harold's name was still on the agenda, but it wasn't centered anymore. I knew that because Victor told me, in his measured way, over coffee that tasted better than it had any right to. They'll want a witness, he said. I'm not interested in theater, I replied. Good, he said. They aren't either. By Friday, Harold stopped calling. His assistant reached out instead, offering lunch, then coffee, then a brief alignment session. I declined each with the same short response. Unavailable. Laura moved into the guest room without announcing it. I didn't comment. We passed each other like courteous strangers, sharing space without sharing intent. On Sunday night, she stood in the doorway of the study. You've changed, she said. I've stopped being edited, I replied. She flinched. You think this ends well. I think it ends clearly, I said. She shook her head. Dad won't forgive this. I looked up from my notebook. I'm not asking him to. The night before the board meeting, I slept soundly. No dreams, no rehearsals, just rest. In the morning, I dressed simply. No tie, no statement. When I arrived at the building, security waved me through without comment. That told me everything I needed to know. The conference room was full, but quiet. Faces arranged into neutrality. Harold sat at the far end, hands folded, posture immaculate. Laura wasn't there. I took my seat when invited. Not at the table, along the wall. Observer status, appropriate. The chair began speaking. Formalities. Process. Harold listened, nodding occasionally, his expression one of patient endurance. Then my name came up. Mr. Cooper, the chair said, we'd like you to clarify authorship timelines. I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gesture. I spoke as if explaining something simple to people who valued accuracy. I laid out the sequence, dates, versions, logs. The absence of conjecture did more than any accusation could have. When I finished, no one spoke immediately. Harold stared at the table. That's sufficient, the chair said finally. Thank you. I sat. As the meeting continued, I watched Harold's control erode in increments too small to panic over, but too consistent to ignore. He wasn't losing power. He was being measured. When it ended, he approached me. You didn't have to do this, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. I did. He searched my face. What do you want now? I thought about that. About Paris. About the café. About the man I'd been when this started. I want you to understand, I said, that I'm no longer part of your system. He nodded once, stiffly. And we'll see. I smiled. We already have. As I left the building, my phone buzzed. A message from Victor. Board vote scheduled? Final. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked into the afternoon, already aware that the next move would not be quiet. Silence didn't arrive all at once. It crept in gradually, like a meeting that loses attendees one by one until you're left staring at an agenda that no longer matters. The first morning after the board session, I woke before the alarm and reached for my phone out of habit. No overnight messages, no passive-aggressive check-ins, No late-night clarifications disguised as concern. The absence felt intentional, as if the system had collectively decided to observe me from a distance rather than engage. I showered, dressed, and drank my coffee standing at the counter. Laura's mug was gone. Not in the sink, not in the dishwasher, just removed, like her name from the distribution lists. At the office, my badge still worked, but the welcome had changed. The security guard nodded without smiling. The lobby screen cycled through corporate values that suddenly felt aspirational rather than declarative. Integrity, transparency, collaboration. Words always sounded best when no one was forced to test them. I walked to my desk, aware of eyes lifting and lowering as I passed. People pretended to be absorbed in their screens, but attention has weight. You can feel it press against your back. My calendar was empty again. No meetings, no placeholders, not even the courtesy of a tentative block. That told me more than any invitation could have. I was no longer part of the flow. I was an outcome people were waiting to see resolved. By mid-morning, I noticed Laura's office light was off. Her desk, visible from the corridor, had been cleared with professional efficiency. No personal photos, no notebooks, no lingering evidence that she'd ever occupied the space. The company had a talent for erasing footprints without disturbing the carpet. I didn't feel satisfaction. What I felt was distance. Around noon, a message arrived from Victor. "Walk later?" I replied with a single word. Yes. The afternoon passed slowly, stretched thin by speculation and restraint. I answered emails that required factual responses and ignored those that invited interpretation. One colleague stopped by my desk, lingered, then left without speaking. Another sent a message asking if I was doing okay, then deleted it before I could respond. The digital equivalent of glancing away when eye contact becomes inconvenient. At 5, I shut down my computer and left without announcing it. Outside, the city hummed with end-of-day urgency. I walked toward the river, my steps measured, my thoughts organized into lists I didn't bother writing down. Victor was already there when I arrived, leaning against the railing, jacket unbuttoned, phone in his pocket instead of his hand. "You look lighter," he said. "I've been edited less," I replied. He nodded. "They're reacting." "Who?" I asked. "Everyone who assumed proximity was protection," he said. "It rarely is." We started walking. The river moved beside us, steady and unconcerned. Boats passed at predictable intervals, their wakes smoothing out almost as soon as they formed. "Laura's position is officially under review," Victor said. "Unofficially, it's concluded." "I know," I replied. "You're not going to ask how I know?" he asked. "No," I said. "You've always known things before they were announced." He smiled faintly. "True." We walked in silence for a while. It was comfortable, earned. "You knew earlier," I said eventually. "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "How long?" I asked. "Long enough to recognize a pattern," he said, "not long enough to map every detail." "You let it play out," I said. "I watched," he corrected. "There's a difference." I stopped walking. He did too. "You didn't intervene," I said. "No," he agreed. "Why?" I asked. He considered me for a moment, then spoke carefully. "Because people reveal more when they believe they're unseen, and because I wanted to know which version of you would surface when pressure stopped being theoretical." I studied his face, looking for irony. There was none. "You were testing me," I said. "Yes," he replied. "And you passed." I laughed softly. "That's generous." It's accurate," he said. "You didn't rush. You didn't explode. You didn't beg for restoration." "I'm not built for that," I said. "I noticed," he replied. We resumed walking. The city lights flickered on one by one, reflections breaking across the water in fractured lines. "I didn't do this for you," I said. "I know," Victor replied. "That's why it works." Later that evening, I went somewhere I knew Laura would be eventually. Not to intercept her, but to remove the illusion that she controlled the timeline of our interactions. The bookstore cafe was busy, the air warm with paper and conversation. I took a table near the back, ordered something I didn't want, and opened a book I'd already read. Around me, people discussed plans, deadlines they couldn't name without irony, and futures they assumed would cooperate. I saw Laura before she saw me. Her posture was tighter than I remembered, purposeful. When she noticed me, her expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to categorize before settling on resolve. "You're everywhere now," she said, standing over me. "Only where I've always been," I replied. She sat without asking. "You're enjoying this." "I'm noticing it," I said. "There's a difference." She leaned in. "Victor told me." I didn't react. "He admitted he knew," she continued. that he let it happen. And? I asked. And you're fine with that, she demanded. I expected it, I said. I'm not offended by competence. Her hand tightened around her cup. You're not the only one who was under pressure. I know, I said. I just chose not to redirect it. She stared at me. You planned further than this. Yes, I replied. Her phone buzzed. She ignored it. This isn't over. It is, I said. You're just arriving late. She stood abruptly, chair scraping. People nearby glanced over, then looked away. As she walked out, I didn't follow. I stayed long enough to finish my drink, then left through a different door. Outside, the evening had cooled. I walked without direction until my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Thomas Reed. Can we talk? I stopped beneath a streetlight and typed a response. You can speak. He replied immediately. They're asking more questions. About me. I put the phone back in my pocket and kept walking. Some conversations didn't require synchronization. By the time I reached my car, I felt the shape of what was coming. The system was tightening, preparing to correct itself, and corrections always had side effects. I drove home without turning on the radio, already aware that the quiet I'd earned was about to be tested again. The house felt larger without Laura in it, not emptier, larger. Spaces stretched when no one was actively managing them. I noticed corners I'd walked past for years without registering. The faint scuff on the hallway wall where a chair had been dragged once and never fixed. The lamp in the living room that only worked if you turned it on slowly. Details surfaced when no one was narrating the day for you. I slept in the guest room that night, not because it was necessary, but because it felt accurate. The bed was firmer, the ceiling unfamiliar. I lay there thinking about patterns, about how often people confuse proximity with loyalty and access with authority. Laura had done both. So had Harold. So had most of the people now pretending they were bystanders. In the morning, my phone was waiting. Thomas Reed had sent 3 messages overnight. I can explain. I didn't start this. Please don't let me be the only one who falls. I read them once and set the phone down. Explanations were currency that had depreciated rapidly. At the office, the atmosphere had shifted again. Not panic, consolidation. People moved in pairs now, voices lowered, expressions careful. The auditors were no longer theoretical. They had offices, badges, preferences for certain conference rooms. I wasn't summoned. That was intentional. When institutions don't know how to categorize someone, they delay engagement until the category clarifies itself. Around 10, I felt someone standing near my desk. I didn't look up immediately. Power does strange things when you deny it acknowledgement. It's worse than I thought, Thomas said quietly. I raised my eyes then. He looked smaller than he had in the parking structure, less confident. His tie was knotted too tightly. Sit, I said. He didn't. They think I coordinated document flow. Did you? I asked. He hesitated again. I followed instructions. From whom? I asked. He exhaled. Laura. Sometimes directly, and sometimes implied. I nodded. And you never questioned it. I thought it was alignment, he said. She said it was for consistency. I leaned back. Consistency with what? With Harold's expectations, he replied. I watched him absorb the words as he spoke them, like he was hearing his own confession for the first time. They'll ask you about intent, I said. Not outcome. Intent is where people get careless. He swallowed. What do I do? You tell the truth, I replied, without ornament. And if they don't believe me, he asked. I stood. Then you'll discover how fragile borrowed authority really is. He nodded, defeated, and walked away without another word. By noon, Laura's name was no longer spoken aloud. It existed only in emails forwarded without commentary and in calendar blocks labeled generically. Transition meeting, access review, policy clarification. Corporate language worked best when it stripped people down to function. Victor called again. The vote is scheduled, he said. Friday afternoon. I know, I replied. You're expected, he added. I'll be there, I said. But not as a participant? He paused. You're certain? I stopped being uncertain weeks ago, I replied. That evening, Laura called. I answered this time. They removed my access, she said. No greeting, no preamble. Yes, I replied. They're saying I breached policy, she continued, that I exceeded my scope. You did, I said. Her breath caught. You could help clarify. I already did, I replied. This is bigger than us, she insisted. It always was, I said. That's why it worked. Silence followed. Not dramatic, just final. She spoke again, softer. You planned further than I thought. Yes, I replied. She laughed quietly. You always did. I learned from watching you, I said. The line disconnected shortly after. I didn't check to see who ended it. On Thursday, the office felt hollowed out. Meetings were canceled preemptively. People avoided corridors where auditors might appear. A company built on certainty doesn't like mirrors. I packed the rest of my desk. Not because I was leaving immediately, but because I didn't need the illusion of permanence anymore. A notebook, a pen, the framed photo I'd almost forgotten to take earlier. I left the chair exactly as it was. As I reached the elevator, someone cleared their throat behind me. It was Harold's assistant, the same one who had offered lunches and coffee and alignment sessions. He wants to see you, she said. I looked at her. He already has. She didn't argue. She stepped aside and let me pass. Friday arrived with manufactured calm. The boardroom was arranged differently again, chairs spaced farther apart, water pitchers placed with unnecessary precision. Laura was there this time, seated near the back. She didn't look at me. Harold entered last, as he always had, but the effect was diminished. People acknowledged him politely rather than instinctively. Authority, once questioned, never fully recovers its former efficiency. The meeting followed procedure, review language, governance terms, transitional framing. Harold listened, occasionally nodding, occasionally interrupting to clarify points no one had challenged. Then the chair turned to me. Mr. Cooper, he said, is there anything you wish to add? I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gesture. I spoke plainly. My work was never removed from the company, I said. It was redirected without my consent. That distinction matters. I paused. I accept responsibility for outcomes I authored, I continued. I decline responsibility for decisions made in my absence. I sat. The chair nodded. Thank you. The vote followed. Not dramatic, not unanimous, just sufficient. Harold's role was constrained. Not eliminated, contained, power reduced to scope. Outside the boardroom, Victor waited. It's concluded, he said. It's finalized, I replied. Laura approached then. She stopped a few steps away, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. You're not done, she said. No, I replied. I'm finishing. She studied my face. What do you want now? I thought about that as I walked past her. The answer formed without effort. Nothing. In the parking structure, I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. I sent a message I'd drafted days earlier, one I'd checked for accuracy rather than tone. Across town, systems adjusted. Access privileges reverted. Schedules recalibrated, displays refreshed. No alarms, no spectacle. Just the quiet realization that the structure no longer revolved around the same center. As I pulled out, I saw Harold near his car, phone pressed to his ear, posture rigid. He noticed me and turned. What did you do? He asked, stepping closer. I stopped participating, I replied. You think this is victory, he said. I think this is clarity, I replied. He stared at me, searching for leverage, finding none. I rolled up the window and drove away. The road ahead was unremarkable, clean, open, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting for anything to happen next. The invitation arrived without ornament, which told me everything I needed to know. Board conference, final session, attendance required, no agenda, no timeline, no preamble pretending this was anything other than a closing mechanism. Harold had always believed ambiguity worked like leverage. In truth, it only worked on people who still needed approval to function. I read the message once and closed it. There was nothing to accept or decline. When systems decide you are a variable instead of a resource, they stop asking. That night, I slept in the guest room again, not out of habit this time, but intention. The bed was unfamiliar enough to keep me alert, and alertness felt appropriate. I lay there thinking about the way institutions end things, not with confrontation, but with process, not with raised voices, but with carefully worded summaries. I didn't rehearse anything. Rehearsal implies uncertainty. I already knew what I would say because it was what I had been doing all along, reducing noise until only signal remained. In the morning, I dressed simply. No tie, no jacket meant to communicate authority. Authority had already spoken, and it hadn't chosen me. That was fine. I wasn't there to be chosen. The drive-in was quiet. Traffic behaved itself, as if the city understood I wasn't in a hurry. When I parked, I noticed security had changed shifts. New faces, new posture. The building still recognized my badge, but it didn't recognize my history. That, too, felt accurate. Inside, the lobby screen cycled through neutral imagery, people collaborating, hands gesturing at glass walls, smiles carefully curated to suggest momentum. I walked past without slowing. The elevator ride was uneventful, but I counted the floors anyway. Old habit. Orientation matters when you're about to exit a system. The conference room had been rearranged again, chairs spaced wider than before, as if distance itself were now policy. Water glasses placed with geometric precision. Notepads aligned but untouched. This wasn't a room designed for debate. It was designed for record. I took the seat offered along the wall. Not at the table, close enough to be acknowledged, far enough to avoid implication. Perfect. Victor was already there, seated 2 rows ahead. He glanced back and nodded once. No greeting, no reassurance. We were past that. Harold entered last, as he always did. Some habits survive even when their purpose dissolves. He didn't scan the room, he didn't perform. He walked to his chair and sat as if the space still belonged to him by default. Laura came in moments later. I hadn't expected her presence to register as much as it did. She took a seat near the back, posture composed, expression neutral. She didn't look around. She didn't look at me. She looked forward, like someone bracing for turbulence they could no longer redirect. The chair called the meeting to order. Process language followed, governance framing, words designed to soothe stakeholders who weren't present. I listened without reacting. Everything that needed to be said had already been written down somewhere. Harold was invited to speak first. He did so with restraint. Acknowledged review, accepted limitations, framed outcomes as continuity rather than correction. It was a skilled performance, but it lacked conviction. Conviction requires belief, and belief had already shifted away from him. When he finished, the chair nodded and thanked him. No follow-up questions. That absence carried more weight than any challenge would have. Then the chair turned slightly in my direction. "Mr. Cooper," he said, "before we conclude, is there anything you wish to add for the record?" The phrasing was precise. Not contribute, not defend, add. I stood. The room stilled, not in anticipation, but in compliance. This was the last procedural checkpoint before closure, and everyone understood that. "I won't take much time," I said. My voice sounded steady, not because I was managing it, but because there was nothing left to manage. "I want to clarify a distinction," I continued. "My work was never removed from the company. It was redirected without my consent." I paused, letting the sentence settle. "That distinction matters because responsibility follows authorship," I said. "I accept responsibility for outcomes I authored. I decline responsibility for decisions made after my access was altered." No one interrupted. No one needed clarification. "I've documented everything relevant," I added. "There's nothing further for me to contribute." I sat. The chair thanked me. The meeting moved forward. The vote was conducted with minimal ceremony, not unanimous, not dramatic, sufficient. Harold didn't react when the result was announced. He didn't need to. He understood constraints. He'd spent a lifetime imposing them. As people stood and gathered their things, the room filled with low conversation. Chairs scraped softly. Pens were capped, laptops closed. Laura turned around then. Her eyes met mine briefly, searching for something that wasn't there. Not forgiveness, not regret. Confirmation. I gave her none. Confirmation would have implied symmetry, and there was none left between us. Victor stepped into the aisle as people filtered out. "It's concluded," he said quietly. "It's finalized," I replied. Different word. He smiled faintly. "You're consistent." Laura approached as Victor moved away. She stopped a few steps from me, careful not to cross a boundary that no longer required definition. "You didn't have to end it like this," she said. "It didn't end like this," I replied. "It arrived here." She inhaled slowly. "You planned further." "Yes," I said. Her shoulders lowered a fraction. "You always did." "I learned to," I replied. She hesitated. "What do you want now?" I considered that as I gathered my things, the notebook, the pen, nothing else. "I want accuracy," I said. "Everything else follows." I left her standing there and walked toward the exit. The hallway felt longer than usual, stretched by the knowledge that I wouldn't be navigating it again under the same assumptions. Outside the conference area, the building resumed its normal rhythm. Phones rang, doors opened and closed. Systems continued doing what systems do, absorbing change without comment. In the elevator, my phone vibrated. A message I had prepared days earlier waited for confirmation. I didn't reread it. I pressed send. The response wouldn't be immediate. It didn't need to be. The adjustment it triggered was quiet, procedural, and entirely within bounds. As the elevator descended, I felt something shift. Not relief, not triumph, but alignment. The kind that only happens when you stop negotiating with a structure that no longer reflects you. When the doors opened, I stepped into the lobby with the certainty that the final movement of this process was already in motion, even if no one else could see it yet. And that was enough to keep me calm as I walked toward the exit, already aware that the real conclusion was waiting outside the building. Outside, the afternoon light looked ordinary, which felt appropriate. Final things rarely announce themselves. They arrive wrapped in normalcy and leave behind a reorganization people only understand later. Victor waited near the curb, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed in the way of someone who already knew how this would resolve. He didn't ask questions. He never did at the end of things. "You going straight home?" he asked. "No," I said. "I'm going to close a loop." He nodded once. "I'll let you handle it." "I know," I replied. He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, you chose restraint where most people choose spectacle." "Restraint lasts longer," I said. He smiled and stepped back as I headed for my car. The drive took me across parts of the city I'd stopped noticing years ago. Office parks that looked interchangeable, new developments promising efficiency and comfort in the same breath. Harold had always loved places like that. They reflected his belief that control could be designed into concrete and glass. I parked near the building he'd once toured me through with pride, pointing out redundancies, safeguards, and contingencies as if he were introducing a favored child. He'd called it future-proof. I'd called it impressive. Now it stood quiet, its reflective surface mirroring a sky that refused to take sides. I sat in the car for a moment, engine off, phone in my hand. The message I'd sent earlier required no follow-up. It wasn't a command, it was a confirmation, a restoration of defaults that had been temporarily overridden. Inside the building, systems would be adjusting, access hierarchies recalibrating, schedules reverting to documented authority, displays refreshing to match updated parameters. Nothing dramatic, nothing broken, just the quiet recognition that a central assumption was no longer valid. I stepped out of the car and walked the perimeter, keeping my distance. I didn't need to go inside. Influence doesn't require proximity once it's embedded. That's when I saw him. Harold stood near his car, phone pressed to his ear, posture rigid, gaze fixed on the building as if it might respond to insistence. His movements were precise, economical, the way they always were when he believed control was within reach. He noticed me and turned, his expression tightening, not with anger, but calculation. "What did you do?" he asked. I stopped a few steps away, close enough to be heard, far enough to avoid intimacy. "I stopped participating," I said. His jaw set. "You think this is a win?" "I think it's accurate," I replied. "Wins require competition. This required alignment." He gestured toward the building. "You undermined my position." "I declined to support it," I said. "There's a difference." He stared at me, searching for leverage he no longer possessed. "You've embarrassed me." "You confused visibility with authority," I replied. "I didn't." He took a step closer. "You could have handled this privately." "I did," I said. "You just weren't included." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Cars passed on the road behind us. A delivery van idled, then pulled away. Ordinary sounds framed an extraordinary recalibration. "You'll regret this," he said finally. I met his gaze without raising my voice. "Regret comes from miscalculation," I corrected mine. His phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, then looked back at me, something like disbelief flickering across his face. "They're saying my access changed," he said. "Yes," I replied. It reverted. "To what?" he demanded. "To what was documented," I said. "Temporary overrides don't survive audits." He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. For the first time, he looked unsure not of outcome, but of process. Power hates uncertainty more than opposition. I didn't wait for another response. I turned and walked back to my car. As I started the engine, my phone vibrated again. A message from Victor. "Effective." I didn't reply. I pulled out smoothly, letting another car merge ahead of me. Patience had become automatic. As I passed the building, I checked the mirror once. Harold stood where I'd left him, phone in hand, framed by a structure that no longer revolved around his expectations. The road ahead opened into something unremarkable. Clean lanes, predictable turns, no urgency. At the next light, it turned green before I reached the line. I didn't slow. I drove forward, not away from anything, but toward a space that no longer required negotiation, knowing the system would continue adjusting long after I was gone, recalibrated by a choice I'd already finished making.